greetings from Team CSP. On behalf of Professor Sangeeta Menon and our entire team, I welcome you today for yet another Friday lecture. So each Friday we bring to you, a new speaker and refreshing platforms which explore and engage with philosophy, psychology, literature, ideas that crisscross these disciplines, to just name a few. So the chairperson for today's session is Dr. Saurabh Todaria. Now, I want to invite Meera Kumar Menon to briefly introduce the topic and also our esteemed speaker for today. Meera, over to you.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Very warm welcome to today's Friday lecture. Dr. Anindya Sinha is a primatologist. He is a professor at National Institute of Advanced Studies. He holds his PhD from Tata Institute for Fundamental Research, Mumbai, and joined NIAS in 1996. One of his important research contributions is that Dr. Sinha was responsible for the discovery of a new species of primate, the Arunachal macaque. Although his principal contributions have been in understanding the structure and evolution of the primate mind. Now, consciousness, as we all know, is an intriguing subject. I'm sure all of us from Team CSP at least will agree. And even more interesting would be to look at animal consciousness. So without further ado, I would like to invite you, sir. He's a very talented orator also, which I'm sure we are about to discover. So there is no confusion that today's session is going to be very fascinating. So over to you, sir. Please begin.
Thank you very much, Meera, and it's wonderful to be here. And I wanted to particularly thank Niharika, Meera, Ashwini, Saurabh, and of course my old friend Sangeeta for your persistence, for following me around even when I failed all the deadlines of sending you the information that I was supposed to. But it's really an honor to be here, and thank you very much. And I look forward to some interesting discussions. I tend to speak a bit more, so I will try and cut myself down so that we can have more time for discussions. So let me just share my screen. Right. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, great. So let me begin, and I always begin my talk with either a poem or a little quotation. And I thought for this particular meeting, I think I will begin with a small line from a French humorist, Malcolm de Chazal, who once said, I'm sorry, one second. Yeah. He said, monkeys are superior to men in this. When a monkey looks into the mirror, he sees a monkey, right? So on that note, I want to talk today about how we study an animal mind, an animal's mind. And Bonnet macaques is a species of monkeys that I've spent more than half my life with. And I would like to also raise some questions about whether we can define consciousness in non-human species, such as the bonnet monkey. Right. Now, just wanted a quick recap that our work has spanned across different levels of social organization, right from communities through species, populations, societies, individuals, and minds. And although in today's talk, I will speak about the mind, I just wanted to sort of give you a feel that when you look at different levels of organizations, they actually talk to each other. So even if I want to understand the mind of the monkey, I might need to understand what kind of communities it lives in, what are the characteristics of its populations, what social interactions does it have, and all these areas therefore link to each other when we try and understand the biology of a species at any of these levels. And therefore, the important questions that I wanted to ask about why one would want to study the primate mind is here. The first, of course, is what is it like to be a monkey? And that's a very deeply philosophical question. And I think I came into this field with the hope of trying to understand one day what it means to be another individual of perhaps another species. A second question, which is more evolutionary, is how did we come to be what we are today? A third question is that based in neurobiology, which asks, can we understand more fully how the primate brain works? And finally, an important question that I think relates to each of us is, will our knowledge of the primate mind influence the way we relate to them? We exploit animals in various ways, we relate to them in various ways, and perhaps our understanding of what their minds are actually capable of doing may color some of the behaviors that we show towards them and the way we interact with them. And I think we can bring this up more in terms of in the discussion. Right. Now, when you look at a primate social relationship, and let me just put this forward, that I think consciousness or the mind has evolved most importantly in the social sphere. And this complexity that a primate, and which includes us, enjoys in its social world can come from two levels. The complexity can come from the level of individual, because each individual has a rich repertoire of ways to express itself, communicate with others, develop complex relationships with others. And at the level of the society, we often end up with complex groups with individuals of different ages, sexes, dominance ranks, genetic relatedness. And within these groups, you may have subgroups, temporary alliances, long-term relationships that cut across these categories. So in terms of evolution, what you then realize, and I think you will see this even when you look at yourself, that throughout in space, we have so many different kinds of associations and interactions with different groups of individuals that we seem to have many alternative strategies for survival, for reproduction. So we strategize every step of the way, depending on which kind of groups we are in, whether it's with your parents, with your friends, with your family, with your professional colleagues. We all have different kinds of behavioral strategies. What is also important is that we are long-lived creatures, just as monkeys and apes are. And when you live in a long-lasting social group, you may have an option to pursue a number of different kinds of strategies over your lifetime, right? And so therefore, the kind of relationship that you have with your parents may be very different from what you have with your partners, or with that of your children, and with your friends, with your professional colleagues. And each of these relationships are unique. And let me assure you that this is true for the macaques as well. And so when we want to understand the evolution of the non-human primate mind, that is those of monkeys and apes who are related to us evolutionarily, one important question we can ask, taking off from what I just said, is, has social complexity progressively evolved in primates? Has social complexity selected for enhanced cognitive abilities when you live in a very complex social world? Has evolution made you much more cognitively capable of being able to handle the social complexity? Can certain higher cognitive attributes be defined functionally in non-verbalizing primates? Now, I know that when I talk to you, I can see what you're thinking, right? But that's because our language helps us. But when primates or non-human primates or other non-human beings are not able to speak to us in language, how do we understand their cognitive capacities? What would be the behavioral correlates of specific higher cognitive processes in wild non-human beings? Are primates capable of reasoning and abstract thought in the absence of a complex language? This is a very deep philosophical question that has often arisen. How much does our language facilitate our capacity to carry out certain cognitive processes, such as abstractions or reasoning? But we can talk about this more during the discussion. And finally, a question that I will address is, are primates perceptually and reflectively conscious? I will define the terms as I go along. Right. Now, when we think of the animal mind and we think of ways of trying to understand the animal mind, there are certain very fundamental philosophical frameworks that we take recourse to be able to address this question. And one of them is that of theory of mind. And very simply, it's this: many primates know and predict each other's behavior, right? We see this even with our domestic dogs, our domestic animals. but are they as knowledgeable about others' beliefs, emotions, or intentions? So I know that you have a certain action that you will do whenever I show a certain action. So if I put out my hand, you will perhaps meet my hand and we will shake hands. So I know that this behavior evokes a certain behavior in you. But do I also understand that when I hold out my hand, you feel happy and you would like to have an intention of shaking my hand, which is when you touch my hand, right? So that is about beliefs, emotions, or intentions. And therefore, Premack and Woodruff, on this basis, argued that when I have some conception of my mental state or my ability to attribute a certain belief or knowledge or emotion to myself and to others, I have a theory of mind. And therefore, if I can now see you and realize that you are a little bored with my talk, I'm able to recognize that I'm excited to give this talk, but you may be a little bored in trying to hear me and trying to understand what I'm saying. And therefore, I recognize a mental state, a particular belief or an emotion in myself. I recognize a certain belief or emotion in yourself. And therefore, I know that I have a mind or a mental state, and that you have a mind or a mental state as well. And that is, I have a theory of mind. Right? Now, clearly, biologists like definitions because otherwise we would not be able to progress. And clearly, as you can see, I've already defined mind in terms of mental states. But let's talk more about this as we go along. Here is a little cartoon which actually tells you the transition that happens in your behavior when you're behaviorally responding to another individual versus when you are mentally cognizing and developing your behaviors in the same situation. So on the left, you have what is sabotage, which is a behavioral response. There are several characters in this cartoon. There's a friend and a thief. And this gentleman tells this young boy here, always help a friend, never help the thief. And so the boy hears this and says, the thief is coming. What will you do? And the boy says, I will lock the box. But when the man asks, the friend is coming, what will you do? He says, I will leave the box open. So these are clearly behavioral responses that you have to certain categories of people. But let's now move to the right side of the frame, where we are now talking about deception. And so now when the man says, always help the friend, never help the thief, and then the thief comes, he says, what will you say? And when the thief asks the boy, is the box open? The boy says, no, the box is locked. But when the friend comes and asks the same question, he says, yes, the box is open. So here there has been no physical action, but you have mentally been able to direct a certain kind of a communication which completely serves the same purpose. So you've now been able to deceive the enemy while being different with the friend. So this brings me, therefore, to how our experiences and our cognitive capacities allow us to develop strategies to deal with different kinds of people that we are in relationships with, or when we don't have relationships and therefore we need to invoke certain kinds of action. In Bonnet macaques, I have actually looked in terms of these years of study at experience and certain cognitive capacities. And some of the processes I've looked at are social knowledge and the conception of the self, which I will briefly touch upon at the end, attribution and intentional tactical deception, referential gestures and multimodal communication, insight into how tools can be used and how they can be manufactured, as well as in general looking at social learning and the establishment of cultural traditions. All of these behavioral interactions are manifestations of the cognitive capacities of the macaques that I study. But since I don't have enough time today, I will mainly talk about tactical deception today, but at the end of my talk, touch upon the conception of the self that we are perhaps seeing in our macaques. Now, before I go further, some of you may be familiar with the bonnet macaque. It's the very common red-faced monkey that you see virtually in all kinds of ecosystems in southern India. It's a species found only in peninsular India. You find it in the scrub jungles, you find it in the rainforests, in deciduous forests, and along the coasts. in a variety of ecological habitats. But what's most remarkable is that there is perhaps no South Indian town or city or village that does not have its population of bonnet macaques. Now, it leads a very complex life, and I will just very briefly tell you that they live in multi-male, multi-female groups of 5 to 75 individuals. The females are what are called philopatric, which means they live their entire lives in the same group that they are born, and they set up very strong linear dominance hierarchies when they reach sexual maturity. Juvenile or adult males, however, tend to move. They leave their natal groups and move to other groups, and this they can keep doing all their lives, or they may move just once, or in some cases, they may continue to stay back in the troop that they were born in. Males usually set up unstable dominance hierarchies through aggression, coalitions, through friendships. And this species is unusual because the males have very strong social bonding, very similar to what females typically have in many of these species. And finally, the society is promiscuous. So every male has an opportunity to mate with every female and vice versa. There are ample mating opportunities, mutual tolerance amongst males, and very subtle female mate choice. There are a couple of points I want to make from here. From this brief description, you'll realize that the life of the monkey is not as simple as we perhaps think it is. They have extremely complex social decisions that they need to take, and that tells you that there must be a certain kind of cognitive capacities that are within them that enable them to lead such a complex social life. The second point I want to make from here is if you look at the 5 males from our Bandipur population, where we've been studying these macaques now for more than 25 years, you will see that not only do these monkeys differ in their hairstyles, as you can clearly see, but they are remarkably different in their behavior, in their life history strategies, in their cognitive capacities, and therefore, I think a general philosophical lesson that I have learned is if you've seen one, you've not seen them all at all. Each is unique. Today, we know more than 2,000 individual monkeys in Bandipur, and I can tell you that all their lives are remarkably different from each other's. Right. Now, let's come to a second philosophical framework other than theory of mind that I was talking about, and this is called intentionality. Now, Daniel Dennett, who many of you may know of, was a very eminent cognitive scientist and a philosopher, and in a series of papers and books between 1983 and 88, he provided a theoretical framework in which we could look at how individuals are able to recognize mental states within them or are able to attribute them to others. And what is an intentional phenomenon? When any being, and that could be you, me, or the bonnet monkey, when any being has a specific mental state, either a belief or a desire or an emotion, then this being is an intentional being. Having said that, so we are all clearly intentional beings, but then we might be able to distinguish between different levels of intentionality in such beings, right? Now, I will exemplify this with just a simple example of my bonnet monkeys. Now, typically in Bandipur, you see that when a bonnet monkey sees a leopard, it gives an alarm call. And as soon as it gives an alarm call, all the other bonnet monkeys that hear this alarm call run up the trees, right? Now, if the bonnet macaque is really a zero-order intentional being, then perhaps it's a simple stimulus response that we're talking about. A monkey sees a leopard, it gives an alarm call. That's it. There is no belief, no desire. It's instinctive. And when you hear an alarm call, you run up the trees. As simple as that. But what if that's not true? What if the macaque is a first order being where it has some beliefs, but no beliefs about other individuals' beliefs? In that case, the macaque could give an alarm call simply because it believes that there's a leopard there. Or you run up the trees on hearing an alarm call because you believe that there is a leopard there, but you have no attribution of beliefs to others. However, when you can get into higher order intentionality, there is some conception that now starts off of others' states of mind. And if you're a second order being, which I think bonnet macaques are, then a bonnet macaque gives an alarm call because it believes that there is a leopard there, and it wants her friends to know that there is a leopard there. He or she wants them to believe that there's a leopard there. So there's now a recognition of other belief system. Finally, and this is what humans are, or most humans are, you can be a third order being. And what is a third order being? A bonnet macaque gives an alarm call because she believes, or she wants her friends to believe that she believes in the leopard, right? So I'm a third order being and you are a third order being. And we know that because I want you to believe that I know what is in the next slide. You may not know what is in the next slide, but I know what is in the next slide. And I want you to believe that I know what is in the next slide. And that is an example of third order intentionality. So therefore, higher order intentionality, which is second or third order, requires the ability to represent simultaneously two different states of the mind, that of the actor and that of the audience, and for me to recognize that there could be a discrepancy between the intentional states held by the two minds. And you will immediately recognize that this kind of attribution is what is important in our own lives, because children learn to attribute knowledge to others. They do this over time. And very, very tragically, there are individuals who are never able to develop this ability to recognize that the two mental states may be different. And this is very tragically, again, seen in autism. What seems to happen is that in autism, the communication ability fails. And it's a bit like this. If I thought that my mental state and your mental state is the same, then I would know what is in the next slide, and you would also know what is in the next slide, because I cannot distinguish between your mental state and mine. And if I know what is in the next slide, and I think I know what you know also that it's in the next slide, why do I need to give this talk? Right? The only reason we are able to have a conversation is because I know certain things that you don't know, and I recognize that you don't know, and I can make you recognize that I know it, right? And interestingly, this is what happens in teaching. A teacher is able to teach a student because she knows what he doesn't know, and he recognizes what she knows that he now needs to know, right? So this ability essentially to recognize this difference in mental states is what allows teaching to happen, which tragically again fails perhaps in the case of autism. But what's again fascinating is that in order for a human being to cheat, which is an anagram of teach, you also need to have third order intentionality. So what happens in human-like deception is that the actor creates a false belief in the mind of the audience. The actor recognizes that the audience's mental state can be changed without changing my own. If I say there's a wolf in my sheep pack, group of sheep, I know there is no wolf, but I want you to believe that there is a wolf. So clearly I will alter your mental state without necessarily changing my own. And that is what human deception is all about. Interestingly, we see such deception in primates and non-human primates as well, where we see an individual often uses an act from her or his normal repertoire in a situation where it is likely to be misinterpreted by the audience, and the actor will then benefit from the use of this tactic, right? And the question I ask is, can some of these acts of tactical deception be genuinely intentional, in the sense that the actor truly wants to change the belief system of the audience without changing his or her own? Right? Now, imagine, as I mentioned earlier, that you could do a certain amount of deception simply by predicting the behavior of others. I can learn that if I say there's a wolf in my sheepfold, immediately you will come running to me. And I don't have to cheat you. I can just learn this action generates the other action. But the reason why this becomes much more important or flexible is when you see that sometimes when I keep saying this, you will not come anymore, right? You will learn that there is no wolf and therefore my action fails. That's when the alteration or the ability to manipulate another individual's belief system becomes important in successful deception. So let's look at it more in what happens in macaques. Now, I suggest that deception is actually an adaptive capacity. It's a capacity, it's a behavioral process by which individuals have been able to adapt to the complexities of social life, because given that individuals communicate with each other in these complex societies extensively, perhaps deception in a communicative network is likely to benefit me or the actor in certain contexts. And if I'm able to gain a certain benefit, it is possible that Darwinian natural selection will lead to the evolution of deceptive behavior in complex social environments. And we can talk more about this in the discussion. Now, when you want to understand the deception that our macaques show, I look at two particular situations. One is what I call context, which is a social situation within which the deception takes place. The second category that I want to talk about is the functional or the behavioral category, which is what is the behavior that the macaque actually uses to deceive others, right? And if you look at context, and I won't spend too much time on this, typically the social context in which we see deception is when there is reproductive competition amongst individuals, when there is aggression and you want to either avoid being attacked or you want to deflect the aggression. It could be competition over food resources when there is low food availability in the group, or it could be affiliation. I don't really like those two individuals being close friends. So can I think of a deceptive way in which I can break their friendship, right? So these are the typical contexts in which we see them, which we see deception. Again, I'm sorry, I don't have much more time to talk in detail, but I can do this later in the discussion. And these are the behaviors that we tend to see that individuals use to deceive others. There could be inhibition of interest. So I'm following a certain individual, and as soon as a third individual notices that I'm following this individual, I stop following this individual. I do other things, and then I wait. And when the third individual leaves, I show my interest in this individual again. And I'm sorry, again, I won't have time to go into the details, but there could be threat behavior, non-responsive behavior, non-contextual calls, neutral behavior, diversion of aggression, many of which actually tend to be used when deception is shown. Let me give an example of non-contextual calls. Now, a dominant male is chasing a subordinate male when he suddenly stands up on his hind legs, looks into the distance, and gives an alarm call, right? Immediately, the aggressor stops, stands on his hind legs, and starts looking into the distance. I know that there is no leopard there. If there was a leopard, the animals would have run, the first animal would have run up the tree, but he doesn't do that. He actually gives a call while on the ground, right? But it works. And this is an important call. So the other individual immediately starts scanning for the leopard, and this individual then escapes. It's used in a context where it is misinterpreted by the audience, and therefore you gain some benefit from it. Now, having said that, how do we know whether these deceptive behaviors are indeed cognitively based? And the answer comes from these different characteristics that we have outlined, and I will very briefly explain to you what they mean. We're talking of generalization, we're talking of variability, and we're talking of flexibility. Now, what is generalization? Now, here on the x-axis are the different contexts in which perhaps deceptive behavior can be shown. You can avoid aggression, you want to disrupt someone's sexual pursuit, you want to pursue your own sexual interest, you want to avoid a sexual advance, you want to avert aggression, you want to obtain food, you want to bring about aggression on someone. All of these are contexts in which you might want to deceive. On the y-axis, you see that there are a number of different kinds of behavioral categories that you can then use. So to avoid aggression, we have seen 7 such different kinds of behaviors being shown. Similarly, if you want to obtain food, there are at least 2 kinds of deceptive interactions that we have seen. So it tells you, therefore, a number of behaviors can be used within each context. But then the reverse is true as well. So for each category of behavior, you can use it in a variety of contexts, right? So if you're using threat behavior, which is the second one on the x-axis here, you can use it in 4 different contexts. Or if you're using a non-contextual call, you can use it in 3 different contexts. So not only can you use one behavior in different contexts, but within each context, you can use a number of different kinds of behaviors, and each individual is capable of doing this. So this is what I refer to as generalization. What is fascinating is that if you look at the variation across individuals, it's very interesting. Here on the x-axis, you have events, which is the number of deceptive acts that particular individuals show. And each dot is a male from one of my 4 troops that we studied in great detail. On the y-axis is the number of categories of behavior that this individual used when showing deception. And you see that there's an increase, a very significant increase with events and functional categories. What does it mean? It means that if you look at individual in position 9 in the events, right? You will see, if you look at 9, you will see that there were 2 individuals, one of whom used 6 behavioral categories, one of whom used 9 behavioral categories. What does it mean? It means individuals who are capable of deception and are very deceptive tend to be deceptive across a wide range of behaviors, right? So that tells you how variable it is. If this was a learned behavioral response, then you would see a stereotypy. Whenever A does a certain behavior, I do a certain response. So then you wouldn't see an individual doing so many different kinds of deception when it deceives more and more. You would see it repeat some of these deceptive acts. So clearly this tells you that there must be a cognitive basis, which is why certain individuals are better deceivers than other individuals are. And I will talk a little more about this as I go along. This is exactly what I wanted to show you. If you look at troop B1, which is a particular troop, you see PK, HL, GD, and PI are 4 adult males. And when I studied this group for about 8 months, there was only 1 act of deception, which was shown by HL. On the x-axis are the different kinds of behavioral deception shown. However, 8 months after my study, there were 4 subadult individuals who came and joined the group: HS, OS, DS, and TW. And what you see immediately is the number of kinds of deception that these individuals shot up. And these are 4 naive individuals who are juveniles, subadults. They've just entered a new troop, but look at their amazing capacity to deceive, especially HS. And this I discuss a little more here. Here is the flexibility that HS showed when he became an adult in that group. He came in as a subadult, spent a year, became an adult, and this I will show you the different kinds of functional categories shown in dark red, which he used to deceive in different contexts shown in black. So when he wanted to avoid aggression, he could show inhibition of interest, he could show affiliative behavior, he could show non-responsive behavior, or he sometimes displayed a non-contextual call. The example that I gave you earlier was actually shown by HS. He could also use the non-contextual call to disrupt the sexual pursuit of another individual. He sees another male following a female, he gives an alarm call that he would give typically to a leopard. And immediately you see that these 2 individuals separate. That is disrupting sexual pursuit. However, he could also use threat behavior to disrupt the sexual behavior of other individuals, and he would use affiliative behavior sometimes to advance his own sexual interest. So as you can see, and this I'm sure all of us know by experience, that you can't keep lying the same way because then you get caught. So here was an individual who was actually altering the various kinds of behavioral strategies he could use to reach different ends. And this talks about a flexibility which I personally believe cannot come about without cognitive capacities, a strong cognitive capacity. So therefore, let me just summarize what we seem to have understood from our work on deception, tactical deception in these macaques. Firstly, individuals who exhibited high levels of deception exhibited great variability and deceived in many different functional categories. Individuals did not invariably use deceptive strategies in apparently identical situations and thus exercised voluntary control over their deceptive behavior. So if A was chasing B, 9 times, maybe only once or twice, B would show a certain kind of a deceptive behavior. He didn't do it all the time because clearly then it won't work. A will learn that this is what B invariably does. So therefore, you cannot always lie. You have to lie sometimes, which means that on occasions when you don't lie, it is in your voluntary control, right? Some individuals change their entire repertoire of deceptive acts when they change their social environment. We've documented adult males who move from one social group to another. Their hierarchical positions in the dominance hierarchy changes, and so does their repertoire of tactical deception. So clearly, depending on the kind of situation you are, depending on the kind of goals that you have, and depending on how you can achieve those goals, depending on what your position in the hierarchy is, you may or may not use deception. And when you do, you use it in different ways. Different functional categories were used by certain individuals to deceive in a particular context, which I talked to you about, while the same functional category could be used in different contexts. The variability, the generalization, and flexibility in tactical deception that Bonnet macaques seem to display indicates a very strong cognitive basis to this decision-making process. And therefore, we believe that mind reading is perhaps the much more parsimonious explanation than behavior reading. So I don't think animals are just learning what to do in certain contexts. They are actually changing their repertoire of behaviors. Therefore, they're taking decisions of certain kinds so that they can most effectively achieve a certain goal. And this, I think, is evidence for second-order intentionality. Let me quickly give you an example of this. Why do I think it is not third-order intentionality? The reason I don't think so is because in chimpanzees, which is the only other non-human species in which people have been able to show third-order intentionality like that of humans, and only that in 2 instances, by the way. So the literature really is very, very sparse about third-order intentionality. Let me tell you what happens. Now, when a dominant chimpanzee male approaches a subordinate male, he does, he threatens, right? He could threaten in various ways. And invariably, what the subordinate male does is this. It's called a fear grimace. This fear grimace immediately tells the dominant male that this male is afraid. And that provokes a greater attack because he knows that the opponent is weak. There was just one instance where in a captive group of chimpanzees, the authors saw that when a dominant male entered the enclosure, a subordinate male immediately gave the fear grimace, but then he did something remarkable. He covered his mouth and turned around with his back to the dominant male, continuously giving the fear grimace, but clamping his hands on his mouth. So this was interpreted by the authors as saying, I know I'm afraid, but I will not let you believe that I'm afraid. So I want you to believe that I'm not afraid. And so therefore, I'm hiding my fear grimace. Now, this is third-order intentionality. We've never seen this in the Bonnet macaques. And therefore, we think that even if it does have a mind, it is perhaps a second-order intentional being. And finally, with regard to intentionality, there were several events of deception by different individuals, which involved the act of physical concealment. They would hide behind trees or rocks. And therefore, clearly, there was a recognition of the visual perspective of the others. And finally, sometimes deceiving individuals exhibited behavioral components that were not really compatible with their apparent belief system. And let me give you an example of this. So there was an adult male who was on one tree, and he was observing another adult male mating, about to mate with a female on another tree. So what this first male does, he starts giving an alarm call that he would normally give to a leopard, and immediately the other 2 individuals start looking for the leopard. And then this male descends from the tree and walks along the ground to the other tree, continuously giving the alarm call. Now, if you see any bonnet macaque when there's a leopard, he will never descend from the tree, sometimes for days, right? So the fact that he descended from the tree and kept giving the leopard alarm call was a clear indication that there really was no leopard around. I knew it. But he didn't seem to recognize that he was doing an action which did not fit in with what he wanted to convey. And what is fascinating is that it works simply because the audience who's observing this behavior also perhaps has an incomplete theory of mind like the actor. So they do not recognize that there are certain behavioral elements which are incompatible with the belief system. And let me just end this part of my talk with one little story of my twin children. And when my twin children were about 3 or 4 years old, we were teaching them how to play hide and seek. So we hid our daughter behind some curtains and told her that she should make a noise, to which she nodded. And then our son came into the room and we asked him to look for her. And while he was doing that, I just called out and said, "Don't make a noise," to my daughter. And she immediately replied saying, "All right." So this then tells you that although she knew she was not supposed to make a noise, what she fails to recognize is that by acknowledging it verbally, she is giving herself away. So this tells you that human children, when they are 3 or 4 years old, also have an incomplete theory of mind. And it is only with time, as they grow, that the full theory of mind develops. But it seems that the bonnet macaques, or perhaps other species of primates, have evolutionarily got locked into that system of having an incomplete theory of mind. They have never evolved beyond that, which humans have. And that tells you, therefore, that there are perhaps parallels which evolution has perfected in for some species, but not for others. Right. So let me now quickly switch gears, and in the another sort of 6 to 10 minutes that I have, let me briefly talk about consciousness. Where does consciousness come into all of this, right? I haven't used that word at all. I've only looked at cognition. I've looked at cognitive capacities. I've shown you how complex the cognitive abilities of many of these non-human beings can be, and how they use those abilities to take fairly sophisticated, complex behavioral decisions. Now, what is consciousness, right? And this, of course, is sometimes impossible to define. And as one of my mentors and one of my gurus, Professor B.V. Srikanthan, who passed away recently, always used to say, he said, you know, I read 126 papers of on consciousness, and there are 126 definitions that the authors have given. Now, this is very true. In academics, I think, and many of us who have dabbled in this field will tell you that it is notoriously difficult to define consciousness. However, I have a little quote here, which I think is very nice, which says, "We seem to be conscious most of the time, but consciousness gives meaning to our lives. The cup of tea that we enjoy, the talk that we enjoy discussing after the coming of the thunder clouds, all of these give meaning to our lives because they take on a different meaning. And much of the time we may be unconscious. I may cross the road, I may be driving my car, I might be making my tea while thinking of completely other things. So when I do that, of course, we are unconscious. But those few moments in our lives when we are really conscious, it gives meaning to our lives, I think, in many, many ways. The second point I want to make is that consciousness, and this is what I believe in, and this may be a biologist's view, it may not be true for many other researchers who look at other kinds of frameworks. For me, consciousness evolves from the central nervous system. And for all non-human beings who have a central nervous system, at first go itself, I would think consciousness may well be a capacity that may have evolved, right? So therefore, if we are conscious, then maybe other than human beings are conscious as well, perhaps. But the more important point is that if they are conscious, it might give them different kinds of meanings in their lives as well, right? That is something we can say. If consciousness gives an added dimension to my life, then if those beings are indeed conscious, they may add on another dimension to their lives as well. This is all I can then say from my own consciousness. But there are important implications of trying to understand consciousness in non-human beings. First, we have always located ourselves in the natural world, sometimes, as Darwin said, as a natural continuum with other species. But Sometimes, according to certain religious traditions or other kinds of philosophical beliefs, we are unique, we are separate, we are in fact even perhaps morally or philosophically speaking superior to other beings. And this therefore makes it important to try and understand whether consciousness or the demonstration of its presence is hindered because of how we locate ourselves in the natural world. Second, if we want to develop scientific methodologies to try and understand consciousness, and I told you about the definitions, for example, that I perhaps need if I'm going to define consciousness, are there limits to our knowledge and scientific methodologies that don't allow you to really explore consciousness completely? However, if we do understand whether under the being is conscious or not, maybe there is a moral and an ethical significance that then comes in with regard to how we relate to these individuals, other beings, how we treat them, how we exploit them, and that becomes an important philosophical as well as a practical concern. And finally, there have been a whole range of theories of consciousness that have brought in. The question is, how plausible are these when we apply them to non-human beings? In fact, I would argue that I might have second thoughts even while applying it to other human beings, because I'm not them, I am me. So I understand myself, but I may not understand consciousness in the other beings. And so therefore applicability of my theories of consciousness may get limited by what is possible in terms of my relationship and my ability to understand where the other individual is coming from. In fact, when we ask the question of whether primates are conscious, I think it's important again to return to this question of definitions, right? So if there are multiple definitions of consciousness, then can we then say there will be multiple origins of consciousness? For example, a certain philosopher believes that an ability of an individual to respond to any kind of external stimulus is consciousness. Therefore, when an amoeba is swimming along and you drop acid in its path, it will stop, it will take a few milliseconds, and it will immediately retract and swim in the opposite direction. According to Maxine Johnston's sheets, this philosopher, the amoeba is conscious because it was able to perceive a certain stimulus in the environment and was able to respond appropriately to it. On the other hand, there are a large number of philosophers who believe only humans are conscious. No other species is conscious. And therefore, consciousness here simply defines on how you define consciousness. Qualia. Of course, the thunderclouds that are coming that fill me with such happiness may fill some of you with dread because you have to go out in the evening. And therefore, this ability to respond to a certain aspect of your environment in uniquely individual ways, in such personal ways that no other individual is able to fathom your qualia at that point of time, immediately brings its own limitations. If I cannot understand how you're responding to the thunderclouds, how will I ever understand your consciousness, right? And so there is perhaps a need for an unambiguous functional definition, at least to a biologist, if we are going to try and establish that non-human primates are indeed conscious. Here, let me just provide, taking off from my theory of mind and my ideas of intentionality, let me just give you two very, very simple definitions of consciousness. When you have a certain mental state, any emotion, any thought, belief, desire, memory, you have perceptual consciousness. And if you use this criterion, then I think most non-human beings are perceptually conscious because they do feel hunger. They perhaps do have a memory. They may have a certain desire or a goal to reach a certain stage, right? On the other hand, when you're able to recognize your own perceptions and mental states, then you're reflectively conscious. If some of you are by now, as I think many of you may be, thoroughly bored by my talk, and you recognize that you're bored by my talk, you are obviously reflectively conscious, right? So if you suddenly feel an urge to have a cup of tea and you say, I'm listening to him, but even while I'm listening to him, I need to go make a cup of tea and I will miss a bit of his talk, so I will lose out a bit. You are clearly being able to reflect on your actions and on your previous mental states, on your other mental states, and that is being reflective. However, the hypothesis that I will now have, and I'll tell you, is that people can tell us what they are conscious of, but non-human beings cannot. And the argument that I make here is that if I were spending 1 week with any of you in a room or in a house where we don't talk to each other at all, not even once do we talk to each other, for 7 days, I will be very hard pressed to establish that you're reflectively conscious. I will know that you're perceptually conscious because you will go and make some tea, you will go and eat, you will read a book, and I know that you have a certain desire, you have a certain belief that you're following. But are you able to reflect on it? Are you able to say, I would like to read a book now, but I'm so bored that I will not read the book now? If you are able to reflect on that, my hypothesis is that I will never be able to decipher this if I was just observing your behavior. It's only when you tell me that I wanted to have a cup of tea, but I decided against it, that I realize that you are reflectively conscious. And that perhaps could be the methodological constraint we live with. We may never really know that non-human beings are reflective conscious simply because they cannot express the complexity. There is a limit to how much simple behavior reading will be able to tell us about mental states. Right. Having said this, I have just one hypothesis that I want to talk about, and I will spend just a couple of minutes on this. Basically, an argument that Srijata Gupta, my PhD student, and I have made is this. We say that consciousness in humans is best understood by, as I said, the expression of their goals and intentions as expressed through language. Thank you. Now, although animals may be considered conscious in the ordinary sense of wakefulness, as well as their ability to respond appropriately to stimuli, like I mentioned the case of the amoeba, of course, a more reasoned understanding of the phenomenon appears difficult, if not impossible, which is what I just said, that will I ever know if you never told me how bored you were with this talk? Can I look at your smile on the video camera and read that you're actually thinking about my talk and recognizing it as a boring piece of time spent, right? It's almost impossible. And that's true for non-humans as well. And human executive functions, on the other hand, such as planning, monitoring, regulating emotions, inhibition of actions, attentional flexibility, working memory, error detection, decision-making, or resolution of conflict, all of these have been traditionally considered behavioral proxies for consciousness in this species, in humans. Therefore, these executive functions, which are controlled by the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is very well developed in non-human primates as well, enable individuals to execute voluntary actions, make choices amongst alternatives, and respond appropriately to novel situations in order to achieve short-term and long-term goals. And therefore, since there is a strong correlation between the emergence of consciousness and the development of these strong, what are biologically called executive functions in humans, we suggest that a bottom-up approach of the kind that I've been talking about, the way you study social knowledge, you study intentional tactical deception, you study attribution of motives, you study various aspects of communication in non-human species, may tell us, may provide an evolutionary approach to understanding executive functions in these beings, and then perhaps decipher what is really consciousness in these beings. And my suggestion would be that these are likely to differ from human executive functions only in degrees, perhaps not in kind. And therefore, by extension, I would argue that perhaps different non-human beings, including my Bonnet macaques, are indeed conscious, but they are conscious to different degrees, which perhaps we need to understand through much more bottom-up functional studies at the ground level. Right. So let me conclude, and I will finish in exactly 2 minutes. I just want to tell you what we now understand of the non-human primate mind, the macaque mind, and this is what we seem to know. First, and this is all that I've talked to you about, maybe some elements of this I did not have time to unravel. Bonnet macaques seem to be inherently capable of solving very complex social problems, as for example, through tactical deception. the species may also be inherently capable of making very complex social decisions on the basis of their experiential knowledge. For example, during competitive interactions between three individuals. I'm sorry, I did not have time to talk to you about this, but what we find is that when an individual takes a decision whether to flee or to fight, or to be there or not to be there in a particular situation, and you try and understand what influences these decision-making processes, you realize that they are taking the decision on the basis of very complex social information that they have acquired about these other individuals. So individual macaques, in fact, appear to have a very comprehensive knowledge of their positions and of that of other individuals in the dominance hierarchy relative to themselves, as well as the social relationships that members of their group enjoy amongst themselves. Individual macaques may thus be able to form rudimentary mental representations which are generated by direct personal experience of themselves or of their social companions. The fact that individuals know their own positions in the hierarchy tells you that they are conceptualizing other individuals in terms of their positions in the hierarchy, which can only come about with some kind of rudimentary, perhaps visual mental representations. But we can talk about this in the discussion. And such individuals may also have a limited capacity to recognize their own mental states and those of their adversaries and act upon the available differentials of these knowledge states. Finally, do these insights that we have now obtained suggest an early evolutionary origin for cognitive capabilities that characterize an objectified self with a certain amount of limited regulatory control over more subjective levels of self-awareness? We think they do have. And if this is true, then perhaps the macaques or the bonnet monkeys have evolved these cognitive capacities much before the great apes, right? But this is still a question mark. We need more studies. But this concept of an objective self, we believe, may involve a kind of a primitive cognitive representation of themselves, which therefore allow individuals to act with reference to themselves. They are able to use their own knowledge to model the behavior of other individuals. They're able to attribute motives or intentions to them. They're able to exhibit visual perspective taking, and perhaps they influence other individuals by intervening in their behavior. Such individuals, of course, as I showed you, could occasionally hold erroneous beliefs. They could fail to project their experiences while predicting the behavioral motivations of other individuals. Again, I did not have time to go into the details, but I can during other times. And thus, even if bonnet macaques, if not a theory of mind, if they do have a rudimentary hypothesis of the mind, it's perhaps a rather incomplete construct. So let me end now, and just wanted to thank a few people. Anirban helped me with the data collection on tactical deception. Sartaj and I worked together on giving it an analytical framework, on conceptualizing it as a cognitive capacity. Srijata and I, of course, worked on trying to hypothesize how executive functions of the humans could perhaps be used to model consciousness in non-human beings. The various institutions I have worked with, University of Agricultural Sciences is where I did much of these studies. And finally, let me end with Malcolm de Chazal again. If you remember, he said that monkeys are superior to men in this, that when a monkey looks into a mirror, he sees a monkey. But then I think there are some inferior humans as well who also see monkeys when they see a mirror. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful talk.
Yeah. Sorry, I took perhaps a little more time than I should have.
No, it's okay, sir. So, sir, we can start with a few questions, and then we can go to Dr. Saurabh for his comments as a chairperson.
Sure,
So,
absolutely.
everyone can write their questions in the chat. So, due to restraint of time, we will be collecting your questions from the chat box, and we will also share Professor's email IDs with you. So
Right.
on the groups and via emails too. So please feel free to write your questions on the chat box.
Right. So I can see one question that has
Akash.
already appeared from
Yeah.
Akash Guglani. And
Yes.
he asks, is this third order intentionality a feature of metacognition in humans? Yes, I think whether non-human beings are capable of metacognition and to what extent they are capable of doing this has been explored. There have been some interesting studies of rhesus macaques in captivity, but you're right that the third order of intentionality is absolutely important for many of these metacognitive capacities that humans or perhaps some non-human species have. And the limitation really becomes in at what order of intentionality we have stopped functioning. Now remember that as third order beings, humans are capable of showing zero order intentional behavior as well, right? So if I jab my finger at your eye and you blink, or your knee jerk response, which is an instinctive behavioral response, is a zero order behavioral response. On the other hand, when I think about crossing a road, and I look left and right, I might just be a second order intentional being because I've learned but that if I don't look left and right, I'll be hit by the car. On the other hand, when I'm crossing the road and I look left and right and then tell myself, why am I looking left and right? It's band. There is a lockdown. There will be no vehicle. I don't need to look left and right. I have brought in rationalization. And that's, in a way, a hallmark of third order intentionality. And we don't really know whether other individual beings, non-human beings, are indeed capable of this. Right. Now, Bhageshri Trivedi asks, is there an ethical structure observed in macaque behavior, that is the use of deception, judged ethically, morally, and alters individuals' perceptions of each other? Lovely question. I personally believe that this question of morality, because that is really very, very third order in a manner of speaking, is very essentially human, right? I think it comes from belief systems and it allows us to
Uh, I think there's a technical glitch. Just wait for Sir to come back. Saurabh sir, till that time we have a question which is not of that scientific kind,
Yes.
which is by Jerry. Can we try and answering it till the time I think Anindya sir gets back?
I think I think better if Professor Anindya discusses, because I think uh, yeah.
Yeah, I think we have Sir. I think just because some internet. Oh, Sir is back.
Yeah.
1 minute. I'm sorry, there was a power failure and I lost connectivity. Is this fine? And you
Yes,
hear
sir.
me? Yeah,
Thank you.
sorry. So what I was saying is that there is a revenge system. So if A attacks B, then within half an hour, we have noticed that B can show aggression towards an individual from A's matriline, but who is subordinate in the hierarchy to B herself. So this is a kind of a revenge system. The fact that there is a kind of a revenge system, would you call that ethics? Would you call that a morality? If by definition you do, then yes, there is a kind of an ethical system, but no way is it as complex as it is for us. So therefore, there definitely, I would say, really no morality in that sense in the case of the macaques. Niharika, I can't
Yes,
see
sir.
the chat box, unfortunately. It may not have loaded. Could you maybe
Yes,
read
yes.
questions? I could leave and come back. Should I just do that quickly?
No, no, no.
Okay. Or you can read it out for me.
Sir, I've copied it again for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, but unfortunately, I can't. My chat. Yes, it has appeared now. Right, 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 right. Yes. So the first question says, just thinking of my work with actors relating to consciousness and intentionality, imagination and visualization plays a big part. Is there any evidence of the monkeys using imagination in relation to the intention of what if function of imaging what might happen? Right. Exactly. No, I'm sorry. I don't think we have any evidence. But then again, I think I would, I'm sorry, I don't know who asked this particular question, but the counter question to you would be, can you imagine if you did not communicate with your actors, just watch them act on stage? Would you be able to ever predict that they are actually imagining a particular strategy before taking a decision to act along those lines? And my answer would be, and you can write back to me if you think it's the other way around, my answer is you will never. You will be able to see certain actions that they're doing, but you don't know whether it's a second order action. Just before doing that action, did the individual imagine yet another course of action and then consciously take a decision to follow this particular course of action? How would you ever be able to predict that unless the individual told you that I thought I could do A or B, but I've actually now done B, right? So therefore, I think my answer again is we will not know. They may be doing it, but it's perhaps a limitation of our capacity to imagine what others are doing. We can imagine perhaps what others are doing, but scientifically, are we able to really understand what is going on mentally within the minds of these other individuals? Perhaps not. Okay. Oh gosh, lots of questions. Sorry, from Ramani Swarna. I like the tactful deception as your premise. Do you think one may generalize this step and apply to other non-human animals? Oh, absolutely. I think so. But I think all of us should go and start looking at it, right? Because much of what we don't know about other non-human beings is because we've never been interested in them. Some of us have been, but in general, we've not. We've just been too obsessed with our own species. We've really not looked at other species, but I think when we go out and look at them, we will discover new worlds, which I think we sometimes have just imagined, right? Prashant, hi Prashant. Prashant Vemuri says about the thought experiment that you were talking about being in a room without talking. I wanted to ask, because talking is most likely an auditory correlation in a mental state. Can we investigate the Bonnet macaque's ability to indulge in reflective consciousness using neural correlates? That's the dream question. One, unfortunately, the problem with it is we get into this correlation causality debate. If I am able to show that whenever there's a tactical deception being shown, certain neurons fire in the brain, do we know whether that is what is driving this, and therefore that part of the brain is really involved? Or are those neurons really involved with a sense of smell? It's a smell that I got when I was showing the tactical deception and it just correlates with it. How would I ever be able to show causality? Yes, we can show causality by stimulating a neuron and seeing a limb extension, or maybe your eye movement, right? Those are simple mechanical actions that we can find neural correlates to. How would you ever do this with imagination? How would you ever do this with qualia? When I'm imagining the blue sky, which neurons are firing? Which neuron is responsible? I think it's there, but I don't know whether we'll ever find it. Yeah, but Prashant, I'm sure we'll have more discussions on this.
Sir,
yeah, sorry.
Rana sir, can we take some comments from Dr. Saurabh first? And then
Absolutely.
If we have some more time, then we can get back to the questions.
Perfect.
Okay. Dr. Saurabh, can I please invite you to have some expert comments as a chairperson of today's session?
Thanks, Niharika. And thanks a lot, Professor Anindya Sinha, for this wonderful talk. Of course, this is a very, like, it has given me a lot of food to think, and but it is very difficult to actually to give the expert comment on that, because it involves a lot of gamut was very wide. But it's still, I would like to ask that one is the Cartesian tradition in the philosophy, which said that animal is basically automaton, and hence because they doesn't have any consciousness. But here Professor Anindya has in his talk has shown, especially the third order intentionality, that how animals are also an agent. So in that way, the agency is granted to their being, and how can they make the complex decision? But one question I would like to ask to Professor Anindya is that, like in the debate in the animal mind, especially in the
Right.
philosophy, so the question is asked sometimes that what is the nature of the mental content, whether it
Correct.
is the conceptual or it is the non-conceptual.
Absolutely.
People who are in the conceptual, they said well, we should have a like a propositional belief, then only we say that
Correct.
it is the nature of the. But
Correct.
on the other hand, there are non-conceptualists, especially phenomenologists, say that our primary fundamental way of being in the world is basically practical in nature. So when
Correct.
a dancer or an actor uh, made the improvisation in dance or acting, so
Correct.
basically understand the context, but
Correct.
this is done in a conceptual way. It is a very non-conceptual manner. So here
Absolutely.
I'd like to relate to your third order intensity question. When you say that it is the ability to recognize the different
Right.
mental between held by the two different minds.
Right.
So ability of the recognition is what is its name?
Sorry, you're getting
Is
cut
it the
off.
conceptual or the non-conceptual in the way the
Okay.
actor or
Right. Right.
recognize? Is
Right.
basically the non-conceptual is nature, the way a dancer or an actor understand the anticipates or recognize the audience and accordingly improvise without involving much of the conceptual judgment. So I
Right.
would respond.
Okay, so that's a very difficult question, Saurav, of course. Let me answer it the other way around. Now, three things I want to say. First is there have been some very limited studies in the laboratory which seems to show that certain species of macaques may have a limited ability to form conceptual categories, right? So for example, by showing slides of mother-daughter versus sister-sister pairs of females within the same social group, individuals react differently to them, even though these are controlled experiments where the pictures of the individuals have been matched for positions, for certain behaviors, for magnification, in terms of identity of the individuals, but they react differently depending on whether it's a mother-daughter or a sister-sister pair. And that, I think, calls for some reflection on whether they are conceptualizing categories. The second point I want to make is from our own studies, when an individual is able to perceive herself as being high ranked, medium ranked, or low ranked, and therefore alter her behavior depending on where her position is. And this is a behavioral decision taken not in response to any kind of stimuli coming from everywhere, it's internally generated. And related to this is the fact that they seem to know the dominance relationships of other individuals in the group. Who's dominant to who? How do they store this information? What is dominance to them? What is subordination to them? Are they able to abstract this across individuals when they join a new group? So it's a bit like this. So when there's a man and a woman, let's say walking down the road, and Saurabh, you've never seen them. So I say, what do you think is the relationship between them? And you say, oh, I don't know. I've never seen them before. I don't know who they are. And I said, let's just guess. And you'd say, you know, from the way they're behaving, they could be husband and wife. How do you draw this inference? Clearly, you have a visual concept of what it is to be a husband and a wife. And when they show those behaviors, you're able to categorize them. On the other hand, you might say they're just friends. I don't think they're married to each other. So we do form conceptual categories which are essentially visual in nature. And perhaps the macaques are doing that. And I think this gets compounded by the fact that since they don't have the kind of sophisticated language that we have, remember, language is important for communication, but language is also important for categorization. When I say dominant, or I say wife, or I say subordinate, or I say husband, you know exactly what I'm referring to. So I have these tags in my mind as well. What does a macaque do? How does the macaque categorize the information she has? Is it entirely on the basis of a visual template in the absence of language? So then, is conceptualization at all possible? It may be limited, simply because I'm not able to tag it in a way. How do I refer back to it? How do I bring it out into my working memory when I need to extricate that information? These are important concepts that I don't think we have an answer to, but I think the question you raise is very, very relevant. And we might not just be able to have answers right now, but I think we need to explore them, perhaps using different kinds of um, models. So I don't know who this is, but there's one question here saying that, I think this is Praveen Veganavar. I'm sorry if I pronounced your wrong name, Vaganavar, who says that they are completely different beings. Maybe we are just constructing models and we have no idea whether this applies to them at all. Of course, absolutely. We are human, so we are only capable of seeing a certain wavelength of light. We are capable of hearing a certain auditory wavelength. We don't hear infra, we don't see ultra. So our knowledge is limited by what we are capable of doing. And that's exactly the same here as well. When we study a macaque, we interpret it on the basis of certain models that we have. Maybe they have a completely different model of functioning. We will never know, but this is perhaps the best we can do under the circumstances. Sorry, Saurabh, I diverted because I suddenly saw a question related to what you were asking.
Yes.
Yeah. Sir, do you wish to take more questions, or these questions I will send them to you?
No. I don't mind being here if other people don't mind being here, if I'm not taking away your time.
No, sir.
All right,
We can
whatever you
answer
say.
some more.
I don't mind being
more
here
questions.
some more time if you want.
Yeah,
sure,
so we can
sure.
take
Let's
like
just
for
do that.
15 more minutes. We can take some more questions if you like.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Okay, sure.
So,
okay, so let me just go back here again. Sure, I think the next question is from Shormishta Dhor. I'm just going in the order that I can see. Bonnet macaques, I think, exhibit a capacity for goal-directed reasoning when they resort to functional tools like non-contextual calls to, say, stave off aggression. In that case, can't it be said that they can be characterized with higher order intentionality? Yes, I think with our limited knowledge and this knowledge is limited not only because we haven't tried enough, but also because our tools are limited. I would argue that we do see certain kinds of cognitive sophistication in their decision making. But if I analyze it very, very critically, the way Dennett has suggested through his intentionality paradigm, I really don't have evidence for third order intentionality, the kind I was saying. So for example, teaching. There have been arguments whether animals are able to teach. The problem is that there are counter arguments which seem to establish, using Occam's razor, that perhaps you can interpret it in ways other than teaching. I will give you a simple example. Bonnet macaques often give an alarm call to a bird of prey. Now, I've seen very young infants sitting by their mothers giving a bird of prey alarm call to a falling leaf, which the female would never do, adult would never do, right? And as soon as that happens, the female, startled, looks up, tries to see the bird of prey, realizes that there is no bird of prey, and smacks the infant, right? Now, interestingly, it becomes a learning process for the infant through a kind of an associative learning that if I give an alarm call to a falling leaf, I suffer pain. Now, this associative learning has taught it, but did the mother teach the young? In fact, a simpler model is that when an adult individual gets startled and realizes that it's a false alarm, in a manner of speaking, there is typically what is called redirected aggression. Often I have seen, for example, an individual suddenly very nervously responding to an aggressive animal who just walks past, and immediately she shows her aggression towards me. It's called redirected aggression, right? And it's known in humans as well. So was this a case of redirected aggression? I'm startled. I realize that there was nothing to really be afraid of. I show aggression towards my young. Maybe the young learns in the process, but is this active teaching? According to some behavioral observers, this is teaching. right? And if there is teaching, that's higher order intentionality. However, if you look at it as saying, no, it has a different psychological model that can explain this particular behavior, then we don't have teaching, then we don't have higher evidence, at least this evidence of higher order intentionality. So it sometimes depends on the kind of framework you're using, and it's difficult to completely unambiguously establish when am I seeing third order intentionality. The case I gave you of the chimpanzee of hiding its mouth while fear grimacing, what if another behavioral observer comes and says maybe a bee stung it and it was just protecting its lips from the bee? Then the whole argument of the third order intentionality in this case collapses. So that's again a problem in a manner of speaking of biology. When you're dealing with multifactorial systems, there are so many factors that can impact a particular behavior. It's very difficult to establish causality. And much of the time, our hypotheses of the kind I was talking about depends on being able to establish causality, which sometimes we can't. So I think that remains a problem. Kathy from Exeter, thanks Kathy for attending the talk. Kathy says, do behaviors such as deception correlate with other indicators of intelligence? I'm not sure what these might be. In other words, is it characteristic of an individual that is very capable in a number of ways? Or might it be more compensatory, or don't we know is lying a talent? I think, Kathy, the answer lies in both. There have been some very fascinating studies by Kevin Lalland, and I can send you the references, where people have tried to look at, number one, the ability of certain cognitive capacities, the ability to express certain cognitive capacities, for example, deception, play behavior, pretend play behavior, which I know you will be interested in because it's about performance as well. Many of these are correlated with the ratio of the neocortex size to that of the whole brain. People have actually found correlations between tactical deception and group size. So individuals who live in more complex, larger groups perhaps tend to be more deceptive. This is working across species. However, again, the problem is when you see this correlation, we don't really know whether there's a causal relationship or whether both these factors, that is living in a complex society and being ability to deceive, is correlated with a third factor, which we haven't put into this analysis. So that is one problem. The second problem is I have my own reservations about doing interspecies comparisons, because each species, and I won't even say species, I will say each population of a species evolves under very, very different conditions. And therefore, to be able to generalize across populations, to generalize across species, is a very difficult exercise. And my final point to you is, of course, there is individual capacity. I think the data that I showed you with HS brilliantly shows that some 4 subadult males, similar in hierarchical positions, enter a group. One shows 9 acts of deception using 9 different behavioral categories. Another individual shows it just once. Why? Just situational? Just coincidence? I don't think so. I think there is an innate individual capacity that distinguishes one individual from another, much like in humans. And I have no reason to believe that it's not so for the Bonnet macaques as well. But I'm sure we'll have more discussions on that. All right. I think Dr. Anindya Barua, thank you for your question. You ask whether there is any ethical attempts to clone gene-edited macaque monkey models, especially on mirror neurons and folk psychology and mental simulation, theory of mind, reading. No, unfortunately not, for 2 reasons. One is when you look at something as complex as mind reading, or you're looking at intentionality, these are such complex behavioral decisions. It's very unlikely, if at all, it's very unlikely that they are correlated with a certain number of genes, right? So much of these sophisticated cognitive abilities tend to take full-blown forms because of the interaction between your innate biology and the environment, right? And that is what leads to individual variability as well. It's not just genetic. There could be, of course, we have shown in Drosophila that some individuals learn much better than other individuals do. We have seen this. However, in the case of the macaques, which is such a complex being, clearly these kind of complex mentalistic decisions are not regulated simply by genes, and therefore having a genetic approach, it's not likely to work. We can look at, for example, in quantitative genetics, there is a way in which you can assay for complex behavioral tasks in simple animals and try and see how much of that is actually inherited. So people have looked at, for example, aggression or the ability to be aggressive in cockroaches, and they have found 3 genetic loci, but these 3 genetic loci are able to explain about 85% of the cockroach's aggression, right? So there is that 15% that we have not been able to explain, even in a simple organism like the cockroach, a complex behavior like aggression. We have not been able to explain it through its biology. There could be environmental influences that come in, or other kinds of influences that we don't really understand. And one point here philosophically, let me just sort of respond to Anindya again, is that where does biology stop and where does the environment begin? I think it's very difficult to explain. And I'll give you one correlational study which is fascinating. In families which have a very large number of male siblings, so all the children are males, many of the youngest of the siblings, the youngest male or 2 of the youngest males, often tend to be homosexual. They tend to be gay. Now, for a long time, there were psychological models that were put forward saying because they were dominated by their older brothers, they tended to have feminizing influences, right? That was the psychological model. You know what the actual story is? And this was a paper that appeared in Nature several years ago. It turns out that when a female conceives a male fetus, she starts secreting androgens, which is necessary for the development of the male fetus. When she has a second son, there is already a certain circulating level of androgens in her blood, and now more androgens get added. So it is with the 3rd son and the 4th son. By the time she conceives the 5th or the 6th son, the level of androgens is so high in her bloodstream that this high levels of androgen has a feminizing influence on the fetus. So not only do you see perhaps the fetus develop, the individual developing sexual proclivities, which are more that of a female or of a feminine nature, but you also see morphological changes in some parts of the brain where the cell types is more like that of a female rather than that of a male, right? So here is a case of a developmental situation where the level of circulating androgens determines your sexual preference when you become an adult. Is this environmental or is this biological? It is biological because when you're born, you've already developed and taken on a particular trajectory which will manifest itself when you become an adult. So to that extent, it's biological, but it is environmental because it's the placental environment of the mother that led to this difference. The fact that there were androgens in the bloodstream that led to this difference. It is environmental as well. So in some sense, therefore, I think it's time that we go beyond this nature-nurture divide and really try and understand how many of the traits that we see, whether these are morphological, whether they are behavioral, and not only in humans, but in non-human beings as well, we see it as a continuum, where even the biology and the environment in some sense becomes a continuum. Sorry, I said a lot, I think, but I think it was important to express that. Then I think Ramani Swarna says, in your talk, you correlated consciousness with the central nervous system. In the works of Homer, I see reference to states of consciousness different from central nervous system. He discusses consciousness in leg and thus one ability to feel pain. How will you answer to this perspective? Absolutely. As I told you that there are various definitions of consciousness, even when you're dealing with the human body, what you conceive as consciousness really differs from author to author. And therefore, I wanted to say that my belief is that in a very broad sense of the term, consciousness evolves from our nervous system. I know Sangeeta and I have had many, many debates about this. When I die, according to me, my consciousness will die with me. According to Sangeeta, it will not. And I don't think we have an answer. I don't think we have a unique answer because we come from very different perspectives. And therefore, we have perhaps different takes on how you define consciousness and whether it will survive. So I used a very simple-minded biologist's belief that somewhere, whether it's the peripheral nervous system of the nerve in the leg which feels the pain, or it's the neocortex in my brain, but somewhere consciousness evolves. And if you look at my definition of executive functions as consciousness, I can even go to the extent, and this is a good forum to say this too, let's do away with consciousness. Let's not have that word anymore in biology. Let's look at different executive functions. Let's look at different cognitive capacities, and then let's judge whether a certain individual has a certain capacity or it doesn't have that capacity. Let's not club under consciousness because there's so much of value judgment given to consciousness. We are willing to kill mosquitoes and cockroaches because they're not conscious. We will think twice about killing a chimpanzee or a gorilla because we think they are conscious. Where do you draw a line? To the Jains, perhaps every living being is conscious and deserves its respect of not being killed, right? Where does one decide? Where is the universal belief in all of this? But yes, as a biologist, I can tell you that if I take a certain function, which I can assay either in the wild or in the laboratory, I can then say, does the amoeba have it? Or does the human alone have it? Does the macaque have it? Or does the macaque not have that capacity? And then you can decide that if so individuals have these capacities, this is what we will treat it as. If they have these capacities which can be assayed, this is how we will treat it. So therefore we do away with very, very ambiguous concepts such as consciousness. I don't think it serves too much of purpose. I think it generates more heat than light. And I'm being particularly I'm being provocative because I want you to think about this.
Sir, should we stop now, or
Sure.
do you want to go ahead? Like, we can stop now?
Sure, absolutely. I'm
Yeah.
sure that a lot of people may want to leave,
Yeah.
but do let me know if there are other questions. If you can just
Yes.
send them to me,
Yeah.
and what I can do is I can write back to you, and you can send back the
Yes,
answers,
yeah.
or whichever way you want. I
Yeah,
mean, I'll leave that to you. I mean,
I'll send the chat box to you, and also I'll share your email address on the groups so that
perfect.
personally they want to write to you, they will.
I think that would be best. I think
Yeah.
if those of you who've had questions that I could not answer for lack of time, if you write to me by email, I'll be very happy to talk to you.
Okay.
And perhaps I might even prefer a telephonic conversation because so much more interaction can happen there rather than emails. So that's fine, but I leave that to you.
Yeah, okay. Sir, I'll share your email ID with everyone. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful lecture, and also, you know, taking a lot of time to answer all these questions. Thank you for being such a sport with us. And thank you for also accepting our invitation. And on behalf of Team CSP and on behalf of Professor Sangeeta Menon, I thank every one of you for becoming a part of this Friday lecture. So the upcoming Friday, we have a very interesting talk by Lakshmi Menon. It's on innovative entrepreneurship, a saga of gratitude. So that's another fascinating lecture that we'll bring to you next Friday. So once again, stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you next Friday. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much. Thank you for all your patience and your questions and for bearing with my wild ideas sometimes. No pun intended.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank
Okay.
you very much. Thank you,
Good evening.
Saurabh. Thank you. Thank you.